I'm Martin. Yeah, I've been working in AR for a really long time, probably safe to say like 15 years or something like that. I came out of like games and computer graphics, and then wound up in a computer vision lab, got interested in AI. So I got interested in all these different things that like more recently have started coming together as what we think of as AR today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about AR in general and some of the challenges and then what we're trying to achieve with this app called Trace, which I'm the co-creator of, to try to solve a lot of the problems that we keep running into over and over and over again. So yeah, I'll just jump in a little bit and tell you a little bit about some of the problems, right? So people are talking more today, you probably hear about like the Metaverse buzzword, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's useful as like a concept, which is, in this case, like you can think about the real world, you can think about the digital world. Today they're basically totally separate, but there's a sort of convergence of these two sort of parallel universes, if you want to think about it that way, where you can imagine digital objects, digital experiences, digital information being embedded anywhere where in some real world analog. So it could be a pure virtual world, it could be a pure physical world, and it could be anywhere in between. So you can think about it this sort of continuum. But building content, building digital content that can exist in that kind of space is currently basically really difficult, right? Typically, you'll have large teams to build experiences. They'll be really bespoke for a particular installation, particular time and place. Often these kinds of projects can run into 6, 7, 8 figures just to set something up, and these are often one-time experiences. So I'm going to run into a couple of definitions. So like augmented reality, AR, what am I talking about? Basically, this can cover like a wide range of technologies and ideas. But what I'm talking about for the purposes of this presentation is some experience where there are virtual elements and physical elements in 3 dimensions, right? So spatially around you. Not necessarily just a 2D overlay, which was more common in early days, like a HUD, heads-up display, where you might have information like, here's the temperature and here's the distance to something. So you could include that, but really today we're talking about like really deeply embedded spatial 3D content. And then there's a question of how that's experienced, how that's presented. It could be on a phone, which is how most people would experience it today. You could imagine some AR glasses, which people are producing. Some headset, which could be somewhere in between AR and VR. Could be through a projector, so it could be light, interacting with the real world without a device in between you and the content. So there's lots of ways that this could be relevant. I touched on the Metaverse before. I sort of say this because I think it's useful as like a concept, but there's definitely no agreement on like what the heck that means. Some people have really strong feelings about it and talk about, it has to include this or that, or it has to be like Web3, or it has to be VR. I don't really think about it that way. Basically, I think it's just some shared persistent hallucination is how I like to think about it, right? There are multiple users, they're all sort of experiencing the same kind of thing, and it's sort of persistent. So you typically you think about this as like an immersive device, like a headset. So to feel sort of present in this is sort of the way people started talking about this. But if you think about like if you were to create a metaverse and everybody's getting a headset and they're jumping in, you could imagine also accessing that content through lots of other means, right? You could get on with a phone, and like if you get onto the metaverse with a phone, is it no longer the metaverse? So I don't think that quite makes a ton of sense. And then the other thing I think is interesting, like AR being this huge continuum, it's useful to talk about like location-based experiences. So this is AR content that's tied directly to a particular physical space. Probably aligns somewhat precisely with the environment. So not necessarily just GPS, right? So GPS will give you a sort of general area, but not necessarily a 3-dimensional pose orientation. So when you think about like an LBX and you think about like AR, and I put Pokemon Go up here, because that's what everybody thinks about, right? But Pokemon Go is like almost barely AR, right? It's like the most successful AR experience, but it's sort of barely AR. And I've been using it forever, right? But I mostly just turn the AR feature off, right? It's more like geotagging than anything else. It's not exactly content that's tied to an environment. It's something that can be sort of superimposed, and it has some light AR features, like being able to move the phone and seeing the content sort of stick. So I'll jump into a couple more key AR concepts. And probably one of the biggest ones for our purposes is world tracking. So there's a lot of terms, they're all sort of related. World tracking seems to be one that people have sort of converged on a little bit, but the idea is you have some device, probably with a camera attached to it, like a phone or glasses or whatever it is. And what we want to understand is where in the world is this device? Where in your room is it? This is actually a pretty complex problem that has only been somewhat solved relatively recently. So we think about 6DOF, which is 6 degrees of freedom, meaning you understand the 3 XYZ position, and then yaw, pitch, roll, rotation. So those are 60 degrees of freedom, 6 degrees. And that's sort of as opposed to some other devices where you may have fewer degrees or more degrees, depending on what you're talking about. So 6DOF is common. That's where you know the full pose of a device in a space. 3DOF is also pretty common. That's where you only know the rotation, right? So if you have maybe a lower powered device, has a gyroscope on it, so that has direction that it's pointing, you'll often see that's a 3DOF kind of device. So like early Oculus Go, for example, would fall into that category. And so that basically gives you camera or head pose, depending on what kind of pose you're talking about. It could be a controller that you're holding. Those could also have some pose. And this is one of the things that feeds into, I worked at a company called Magic Leap. We talked about this as like pixel stick. So the idea being, if you have some virtual content in a real world, how much does it feel like it sticks to a real position, right? If I put a virtual cat on my desk and I look away and I come back, or if I shake my head around a little bit, does it feel like it's really stuck on that table? So the first thing to think about is how good is the pose of your camera, because that's going to give you, if you have a lot of latency with the pose, or if it's not very accurate, then it'll kind of look like it's swimming a little bit. So that's kind of something you might see content. It doesn't quite look like it's really embedded. And then the other part is, this doesn't matter as much for like a camera-based device where you have imagery of the background and then imagery superimposed, virtual imagery superimposed, because you can understand like it's the same sort of frame. But if you have like a head-worn device that's, for example, additive, right? So it's like a see-through device, and you want to put things on top of that, and that becomes a little bit another layer of like complexity, because you might be drawing content slightly later than the image you perceive through the clear lens. And then SLAM is simultaneous localization and mapping, and that's sort of the key technology or set of technologies that is most often used to give you that 6 degree of freedom position within some map, within some space. I have a few images up here. I think it's useful to like, this is a little bit more, some of this is not strictly necessary for like being able to use an AR app or experience an AR app, but I think as like creators, it's useful to understand a little bit of the fundamental problems that we're encountering. So when we see stuff that seems a little weird, we can come back and think about these like core ideas, right?